what I've gained from this study is that I'm seeing a system of religion, of polity, and of military that, like the Hebrews, the patriarchal system, it's all woven into one, while we have in our governments separation of powers. In both the Hebrew religion, faith, life, economy, and the Druid economy, they're all one. And to tell you the truth, they're quite close to each other. In modern scholarship, the last 100 years, we have gotten really a much different picture of who the Druids were than before that. 19th century, for instance, the primary sources that were used, Roman historians mainly, were taken without being critical. And it almost appears that the Romans spoke of the Druids like they spoke of the Jews, very pejoratively, very much attributing their own evil acts to another group. You know about how they did that with the Jews, but more and more I think that they did it with the Druids too, because if the Druids did all that some of these Romans say that they did, they wouldn't have a civilization as they had that lasted for long, long centuries. I'm going to share the screen. You don't need to look at it, though, if you don't want to, because I'm going to read pretty much what's there on these primary accounts. That is, when I say a primary account or a primary source, I'm talking about somebody that was there, that witnessed these people, that wrote it down, and of course, whatever their impressions were came through their subjective minds. So when we get, for instance, a quote from Caesar, Julius Caesar, Caesar on the Druids, yes, he knew them, he fought them, but they were his enemy. Though Caesar's pretty even-handed, his writings are quite interesting. If you like war stories and strategies, very good. When I was in school taking second year Latin, we read Julius Caesar, his Conquest of Gaul, and I have some from him. The other historian that I'm going to quote here is Tacitus, or Tacitus. Julius Caesar, of course, he lived 1st century BC. He conquered Gaul, which is France, about 50 BC. Then we have Tacitus writing from 200 years later, who was able, with some authority, to write about Britain because his father-in-law, Agricola, was a governor of Britain during the time when Britain was in the process of being subdued. So both of these have a pretty good eye for what was going on in Britain and Gaul. However, their prejudices are quite easy to recognize. I think I'm just going to start with the military campaign in Britain. This is from Tacitus, chapter 29. I found some dandy maps on here. Going out to Allison's favorite place on Pinterest. Pinterest? I got some good maps. I'll probably put this up somewhere on the web so I can get to it again. Primarily, the battles were in a place called Siluria, which today would be, oh, we'd say northwest Wales. Let me show you, for instance, on this map. Here's Siluria. When we get to Paul and the Druids, it is Silurians that Paul was familiar with and wrote about, or wrote to. And you see, this is kind of a northwestern portion of Wales. Caesar came in here and here and here, trying to get on the island when he invaded in around 58 BC, I think. Londinium, there's another word for that, but you can recognize it, London something, that I'll use here in this writing, is right here, same place it is today pretty much. It was a very strong Roman outpost, and that's how it started. And you read about the various groups in Britain. There were many tribes. Probably the most powerful tribe was the Iceni. That's spelled I-C-E-I-I, the last I is plural. The Iceni. And here we see another one, Brigantes. We get up here in Scotland. Here's Hadrian's wall that came in the 2nd century AD to cut the British part off from the barbarians up north, the Scots, the Picts, and the so forth, Caledonians. We don't read much about them now in the histories, but we do. A lot of these places that are on this map are on there because they're mentioned in the ancient historians. Now from Tacitus, chapter 29, the military campaign in Wales, or Siluria. During the consulship of Lucius Caecilius Paetus and Publius Petronius Turpillianus, 60 to 61 AD, a dreadful calamity befell the army of Britain. What was happening here is Claudius had come into the empire after Caligula. Caligula was murdered. Claudius was his uncle. Claudius was much older, and he kept himself safe by pretending that he was retarded. Yes, he did that his whole life, and now he's middle-aged, and the Praetorian Guard comes and looks for Claudius, and the Praetorian Guard hails him the new emperor. Whoever the guard made emperor was the emperor, remembering that the Praetorian Guard was made up primarily of Germans. But they had the stronghold in Rome itself. They were the private army of the emperor, something like Hitler had, his SS. And Claudius came 100 years after Caesar's attempts to conquer Britain. See, Claudius had not conquered anything, whereas his predecessor, his nephew Caligula, had sent armies up to Gaul to conquer a certain part of Gaul. And when he got up there with the armies, what he did was in order to conquer Gaul, he ordered them down on the seashore and had them collect seashells. And then he proclaimed himself the conqueror of Gaul and brought the soldiers back with their seashells. That's what he did. Here we were not going to get another emperor that couldn't conquer something. So since Julius Caesar 100 years before had made some inroads into Britain, not very many, but enough for them to go and try to conquer that island again. And they bit off a little more than they could chew, ostensibly. And to read about those years through the eyes of Cassius Dio, or Tacitus, if you like that kind of literature, is quite interesting, all right. Very bloody. A dreadful calamity befell the army in Britain. So we're in the middle of the 1st century. We're in the time that Paul's preaching. This is just before the great tribulation of Nero spoken about in the Revelation. Aulus Didius, he's a general, he's a governor, as has been mentioned, aimed at no extension of territory, content with maintaining the conquests already made. The next governor, Veranius, who succeeded him, did little more. These guys were primarily people high up in the family ranking. They would, at that time, generals would not be picked out of the army or governors out of the army. Primarily, they're picked from the Senate or picked from rich people that simply needed to make more of a name for themselves or to conquer more territory for themselves. And so oftentimes these governors would be rich men who had no military backing or training that wanted to just retain the status quo because they were making so much money out of these provinces. Why stir the pot? Veranius, who succeeded him, did little more. He made a few incursions into the country of the Silures, that's Wales. Of course, he just did that so it would look like he was doing something. And he was hindered by death from prosecuting the war with vigor. He'd been respected during his life for the severity of his manners. In his end, the mark fell off, and his last will discovered the low ambition of a servile flatterer, who, in those moments, could offer incense to the next emperor, Nero, and add with vain ostentation that if he lived 2 years, it was a design to make the whole island obedient to the authority of the prince, speaking of Nero. At that time, these rich guys would show their wills to the emperor because they would, out of custom, leave half of their estates to the emperor because in those days the emperor would take their estates when they died. So the hope was, I can give half to the emperor now, and when I die, the emperor won't come and take the rest of it and kill my family. That was customarily what was done. Paulinus Suetonius succeeded to the command. This is not the Suetonius that wrote the 12 Caesars. This is way before that. An officer of distinguished merit, to be compared with Corbulo was his ambition. Corbulo was a great conqueror of various inner Europe provinces, and he was also involved in the conquest of Israel. His military talents gave him pretensions, and the voice of the people who never leave exalted merit without a rival raised him to the highest eminence. By subduing the mutinous spirit of the Britons, he hoped to equal the brilliant successes of Corbulo in Armenia. With this view, he resolved to subdue the Isle of Mona, a place inhabited by a warlike people and a common refuge for all the discontented Britons. Little pictures of the Isle of Mona here, as it stands today, with some ruins, and some Roman ruins there, I might add. Beautiful place on the map. It's up here. In order to facilitate his approach to a difficult and deceitful shore, he ordered a number of flat-bottomed boats to be constructed. In these he wafted over the infantry, while the cavalry, partly by fording over the shallows and partly by swimming with their horses, advanced to gain a footing on the island. It had only been recently here that flat-bottomed boats were being used for shallow places and rocky places. On the opposite shore stood the Britons. And when we think of Britons, we're going to think of Druids because they're the same thing. Close embodied, prepared for action. Listen to this description. Women were seen running through the ranks in wild disorder, their apparel funeral, their hair loose to the winds, in their hands flaming torches, and their whole appearance resembling the frantic rage of the Furies. I was going to say the Furies, but how about the Valkyries of German literature? These flying women with teeth and hair, or even the Revelation, the things that came out of the pit with hair flying all over and teeth and stings. The Druids were ranged in order with hands uplifted, invoking the gods and pouring forth horrible imprecations. Makes me think of Masada. The novelty of the fight struck the Romans with awe and terror. They stood in stupid amazement, as if their limbs were benumbed, riveted to one spot, a mark for the enemy. Remember how we have read about the wild Indians in our country here in America that inhabited the place, and how they would come out screaming like banshees and scare armies to the point where they couldn't even fight anymore. The exhortations of the general diffused new vigor through the ranks. I think that means the ranks of Britain. And the men, by mutual reproaches, inflamed each other to deeds of valor. You can do it. Go. They felt the disgrace of yielding to a troop of women and a band of fanatic priests. They advanced their standards, the things that they carried, that they worshipped, with a sign's picture of the emperor on the top. Same things that they brought in the gates of Jerusalem, that was an abomination that made desolate. And they rushed on to attack with impetuous fury. The Britons perished in the flames, which they themselves had kindled. The island fell, and a garrison was established to retain it in subjection. The religious groves, dedicated to superstitious and barbarous rites, were leveled to the ground. There were no more barbarous rites than what the Romans did. It was just that they were somebody else's rites and not theirs. They called the Christians atheists or barbarians, for instance. In those recesses, the natives stained their altars with the blood of their prisoners, and in the entrails of men explored the will of the gods. This was a common practice in Rome too, especially the using goats and domesticated animals. We have an account of the Emperor Titus before he goes to battle in Jerusalem, going to the Temple of Venus and having livers read as to what his fate would be in the falling of Jerusalem. And Titus, he went through 2 livers, didn't like it. So the 3rd liver finally got him what he wanted. That is, you cut an animal open or a person, pull their liver out, and read their liver for the future. It's like, I think 20 years ago, we had this bunch of gypsies that were called iridologists. They would look in your eye and they would tell you what all your diseases were. Wonder what happened to that. While Suetonius was employed in making his arrangements to secure the island, he received intelligence that Britain had revolted and that the whole province was up in arms. Now we get to Boudicca, one of our favorite characters. Prasutagus, the late king of the Icanians, a major ethnic group in Britain, Siluria, in the course of a long reign had amassed considerable wealth, as did most of them. Paul's friend, Seneca, became the wealthiest man in the whole world through his investments and in Britain and his ability to use his high position with Nero to cheat the people in Britain. The wealthiest man in the world, considerable wealth there. By his will, he left the whole of his two daughters and the emperor in equal shares, conceiving by that stroke of policy that he should provide at once for the tranquility of his kingdom and family, which I explained. The event was otherwise. His dominions were ravaged by the centurions. The slaves pillaged his house, and his efforts were seized as lawful plunder. This is what Nero did. His wife, Boudicca, was disgraced with cruel stripes, her daughters ravished, and the most illustrious of the Icanians were, by force, deprived of the positions which had been transmitted to them by their ancestors. The whole country was considered a legacy bequeathed to the plunderers. The relations of the deceased king were reduced to slavery. Now think of it. This was a king. The Romans came in, took care of him, and raped his daughters after they had had a treaty together. There's a treaty between Rome and the Icanians that Rome would not come up there at all. But when they came to deliver the treaty from Rome, this is what they did. Yeah, they delivered the treaty, but they came to rape and pillage. And Boudicca was incensed, exasperated by their acts of violence and dreading worse calamities. The Icanians had recourse to arms. The Trinobantians joined in the revolt, another ethnic group. The neighboring states, not as yet taught to crouch in bondage, pledged themselves in secret councils to stand forth in the cause of liberty. What chiefly fired their indignation was the conduct of the veterans, lately planted as a colony at Camulodunum. I think that's same as London, because London is spoken of later as being destroyed. And I'm thinking that the Britons here, the veterans, are the veterans of the Romans, who really, the Roman army didn't get anything except a small wage and the plunder that they would be able to take. It was the noblemen that were generals and governors that got the money. These men treated the Britons with cruelty and oppression. They drove the natives from their habitations, and calling them by shameful names of slaves and captives added insult to their tyranny. In these acts of oppression, the veterans were supported by the common soldiers, a set of men by their habits of life, trained to licentiousness, and in their turn expecting to reap the same advantages. What would keep these soldiers in their armies, in their legions? They were not primarily Romans that were trying to defend the Roman Empire. These were foreigners. They were mercenaries, and you would entice them in with promises of plunder, not through wages, but a young man that was out there in the provinces somewhere in Moesia or Thracia, they found no other way to get out of their situation but to join up. There was actually one Roman emperor that was a slave in Thracia that came to be emperor through his deeds in the army. Unfortunately, its empire didn't last for more than a month or 6 weeks because the noblemen in Rome didn't like where he came from, and because his way of living was also licentious and crude, according to these high livers. High livers. These men treated, okay, I got that. Shameful natives. In these acts of oppression, I did that one. The veterans. The temple built in honor of Claudius was another cause of discontent. They tore down one of their worship places. They built a Roman colonnaded temple to the Emperor Claudius. And of course, these Britons, on top of one of their worship places, was not going to worship a man, an emperor, especially one that had come up to conquer. I don't think it's spoken of in this particular passage, but in the temple of Claudius, when Boudicca brought her 250,000 men army down toward Londinium, the Romans that were close to this temple locked themselves in there, thinking that there was no way the Britons were going to get in. And inside that temple were the patrons, the rich, those in power, were all in there together. And the Britons just decided to burn the place, which they did, and killed them all. And this was the high point for the Britons, the low point for the Romans, especially in their esteem back home. That is the burning of the temple to Claudius, with all of those people inside that were so important, that set the Roman Empire back so far. The temple built in honor of Claudius was another cause of discontent. In the eye of the Britons, it seemed the citadel of eternal slavery. The priests, appointed to officiate at the altars with a pretended zeal for religion, devoured the whole substance of the country. Tacitus is being very honest here. To overrun a colony which lay quite naked and exposed without a single fortification to defend it did not appear to the incensed and angry Britons an enterprise that threatened either danger or difficulty. The fact was, the Roman generals attended to improvements to taste and elegance, but neglected the useful. They embellished the province and took no care to defend it. The Romans were a very superstitious lot. And when Paul speaks of the Greeks at the Areopagus, when he says, I perceive that you are very superstitious, some translators have written in there religious, but Paul is talking about superstition because in the Greek and Roman way of life, anything that you saw could be an omen. A bird with a broken wing, lightning or thunder, any kind of unusual thing. We read it in Josephus about these particular kinds of, what do they call them? I almost get it. I can't. Strange things that happen, like a cow had a kid, a goat, or a strange light came from heaven. I almost got it. Can't think of it. Prodigies, there, they came. Roman, when I was in school back years ago, I read an account of a Roman man writing about how he feared the gods, and that every step he took, he was in fear that he would insult one of the gods, and that God would bring disfavor on him and bring, if he stepped on a crack, a god would break his mother's back. While the Britons were prepared to throw off the yoke, the statue of victory erected at Camulundunum, there was the word. I think that's London. There was a victory statue there because the Romans had conquered Britain, but they replaced it. Later, it was replaced with this one. How do you like that? This is the statue of Boudicca addressing her army you already know the story, but I'm going to read it again. That's where the old statue was. It fell from its base without any apparent cause and lay extended on the ground with its face averted, as if the goddess yielded to the enemies of Rome. They even notice here which way the face is facing, because it makes a difference. It's bad enough the statue falls, but the superstitious notion that the face is facing the other way makes it a double indemnity. Women in restless ecstasy rushed among the people and with frantic screams denounced impending ruin. In the council chambers of the Romans, hideous clamors were heard in a foreign accent. Savage howlings filled the theater. And near the mouth of the Thames, the image of a colony in ruins was seen in the transparent water. The sea was purpled with blood, and at the tide of ebb, the figures of human bodies were traced in the sand. By these appearances, we might say prodigies, which they considered being signs from the gods, the Romans were sunk in despair, while the Britons anticipated a glorious victory. Suetonius, in the meantime, was detained in the Isle of Mona. Remember, that's where they had an uprising, and he was there. That looks like a beautiful place, though. I couldn't find a bigger picture. I thought, oh, I would love to be there right now. Wouldn't that be fun? Have you ever been to England or Wales? I'm Welsh. Have you? Oh, yeah, you have. I'm Welsh on one side of the family. Never been to Wales. I've been to England twice for extended periods, but it was always raining, foggy. I was down on Piccadilly Circus in 1970 in my pink tie-dyed pants and luminescent shirt. What do you think of that? Yeah, I had long hair. In this alarming crisis, the veterans sent to Catus Decianus, the procurator of the province, for reinforcement. 200 men, and those not completely armed, were all that the officer could spare. Count that on your hand, 200. The colony had but a handful of soldiers. Their temple was strongly fortified, and there they hoped to make a stand. But even for the defense of that place, no measures were concerted. Secret enemies mixed in all the deliberations. No fosse was made, whatever that is. No palisade thrown up. Nor were the women, and such as were disabled by age or infirmity, sent out of the garrison. Unguarded and unprepared, they were taken by surprise, and in the moment of profound peace, overpowered by the barbarians in one general assault. The colony was laid waste with fire and sword. Today, on the Smart News, there was a new genetic study out. The genetic study used corpses from numerous cemeteries around Britain and Europe, took samples from all these corpses, did genetic tests on them, and tried to determine who the barbarians were. Barbarians simply means bearded people in Greek, people with beards. At the time, Romans didn't wear beards. What was their conclusion? Their conclusion was that the people from the north that showed their genetic provenance to be in the north of Europe were the leaders and movers and shakers with all the wealth. But in the same tombs, you would find genetic types that were more Mediterranean, that had no possessions, and were there as underlings in the tomb to those whose death they marked, and oftentimes family and full households in these tombs. So the genetic markers could say that these Visigoths and barbarians and Lombards, Longbeards, they were not of one particular race or genetic heritage. There were lots of different people amassed together. Josephus, when he writes his Wars of the Jews to Jews beyond the Euphrates River, addresses them as barbarians as well. So here they're even calling these Britons barbarians. But of course, we've seen Braveheart, how these guys had real long hairs and tattoos and a blue paint all over them and everything, right? The temple held out, but after a siege of 2 days, was taken by storms. Maybe this is what I'm thinking of. Petilius Carialis, who commanded the 9th Legion, marched to the relief of this place, to the temple. The Britons, flushed with success, advanced to give him battle. The legion was put to the rout, and the infantry cut to pieces. Carialis escaped with the cavalry to his entrenchments. Catus Decianus, the procurator, dreading the indignation of a people whom by rapine and oppression he had driven to despair, betook him to flight and crossed over into Gaul, much like the procurator Pontius Pilate did after the crucifixion of Yeshua. He had to split out of there immediately. They sent him back to Spain. And if we look into the Annals of Paul, we learn that if it's true, the procurator Pontius Pilate ended up drowning in Lake Pilate in Switzerland. I don't believe it, but maybe. Sorry, I get off on these tangents. I'm trying not to get too far off. I was wondering if there wasn't a chat here. You're half Welsh and half Scottish. My grandmother, paternal grandmother, was pure Welsh. Some of her cooking was even Welsh. Aha. Well, you got something in common with Lee Hayhurst there. The only thing is, you pronounce it Scottish, he pronounced it Scottish. Suetonius, undismayed by this disaster, marched through the heart of the country as far as London, Londinium, a place not dignified with the name of a colony, but the chief resident of merchants and the great mart of trade and commerce. It was the British Babylon there. At that place, he meant to fix the feet of war. But reflecting on the scanty numbers of his little army and the fatal rashness of Carialis, he resolved to quit the station and, by giving up one post, secured the rest of the province. Neither supplications nor the tears of the inhabitants could induce him to change his plan. Imagine, Romans there, all your Kmarts, your Walmarts, all run by Romans or their slaves, and their general and their procurator and their governor saying, there's nothing we can do, here they come. But they had no idea of how many were coming, and they wailed and begged. But the government had nothing for them. The signal for the march was given. All who chose to follow his banners were taken under his protection. Of all who, on account of their advanced age, the weaknesses of their sex, of the attractions of the situation, thought proper to remain behind, not one escaped the rage of the barbarians. The inhabitants of Verulamium, a municipal town, were in like manner put to the sword. The genius of a savage people leads them to always in quest of plunder, and accordingly the Britons left behind them all places of strength. Tacitus is telling us something here again that is a characteristic, above all, of the Roman army. By reading between these lines, we might understand why our understanding of Druids in the last 150 years or more has changed. Every one of these failures of the Druids, of the Britons, are well-known failures of the Roman armies. Wherever they expected feeble resistance and considerable booty, there they were sure to attack with the fiercest rage. Military skill was not the talent of barbarians. The number massacred in the places which have been mentioned amounted to no less than 70,000, all citizens or allies of Rome. To make prisoners and reserve them for slavery or to exchange them was not in the idea of a people who despised all the laws of war. We're talking about the Druids here. We will see later in the Druid Triads just what their philosophy was according to war. They didn't take prisoners. They wanted no threat afterwards. Didn't exchange prisoners. They hated war. How can a barbarian people hate war? I don't know if you have watched the series, The Man in the High Castle. Anybody? In The Man in the High Castle, after the Second World War, Japan won on the west, Germany won on the east, and the Pacific states up to the Rocky Mountains are in Japanese hands. The Greater Nipponese Empire. And on the other side, up to the Mississippi River, is Nazi America. And it's set in the, I'd say in the 60s. And what you have here are two master races, the Japanese, whose provinces are poor and brutal, and the Nazis, whose provinces, yes, they're still brutal, but they're high up in the economic scale, have all these other people living there that they really want to get rid of. Jews, in the case of on the West Coast, they want to get rid of all Caucasians. They're finding ways to do that, and at the same time, these two greater empires are fighting against each other, wanting to eliminate the other, while in the areas of the Rocky Mountains, this is what they call The neutral zone? Or is that Star Trek? The neutral zone. People want to get to the neutral zone, which is kind of like 1960s America. What we're seeing in this television show, though, from our point of view, which we have never even considered before, it's what it's like to be subjugated or considered inferior for either cultural or racial reasons. And how these common people are trying to work to bring forth a more homogeneous America. It's a good show. Then we can go far as back as the American Indians losing their land, whom we considered barbarians, that really weren't, but were pushed to barbarous acts on account of the way they were subjugated. What year? Who is in it? Sounds interesting. It's on Amazon right now. Used to be on Netflix, but if you got Amazon Prime, it's on right now. Of course, it's free. It wasn't long ago. I'm watching it the second time. I watched it a couple years ago. I haven't looked at TV for a long time. I've been engaged with some socially disparaging kind of television shows. The name of it is The Man in the High Castle. Well, the overarching theme, and there are these films that if you watch these films, it shows what really is supposed to have happened. There's like two realities. I don't want to spoil it for you if you want to watch it. The number massacred in the places which have been mentioned amounted to no less than 70,000, all citizens of allies of Rome. Think of 70,000. But what I have read, I don't know if it's in Tacitus or in Cassius Dio or one of the other Roman historians, is that Boudicca amassed 250,000 in her army, and she led it herself. I think I passed that up. I didn't mention that before. This whole traverse to London from north near what became Hadrian's Wall, where Boudicca was and the other queens up there, she brought a larger army than Rome had altogether. They didn't have a chance until later when technology broke in. Chat. Name again. Yeah, that's right. We call Allison Boudicca. But she's tough. The Man in the High Castle. Aware that vengeance would overtake them, they were resolved to make sure of their revenge and glut themselves with the blood of their enemies. The 14th Legion, with the veterans of the 20th and the auxiliaries from the adjacent stations having joined Suetonius, his army amounted to little less than 10,000 men. Thus reinforced, he resolved without loss of time to bring on a decisive action. For this purpose, he chose a spot encircled with woods, narrow at the entrance, and sheltered in the rear by a thick forest. In that situation, he had no fear of an ambush. The enemy, he knew, had no approach but in front. An open plain lay before him. He drew up his men in the following order. The legions in close array formed the center. The light armed troops were stationed on hand to serve as occasion might require. The cavalry took post in the wings, as usual. The Britons brought into the field an incredible multitude. They formed no regular line of battle. Detached parties and loose battalions displayed their numbers. In frantic transport, bounding with exultation, and so sure of victory that they placed their wives in wagons at the extremity of the plain, where they might survey the scene of action and behold the wonders of British valor. That is written in such a way you could almost see that. I don't want to go too long here. I'm going to go one more and then pick it up next time. Boudicca in a chariot with her 2 daughters before her, remembering what happened to them, drove through the ranks. She harangued the different nations in their turn. This, she said, is not the first time that the Britons have been led to battle by a woman. And now she did not come to boast the pride of a long line of ancestry, nor even to recover her kingdom and the plundered wealth of her family. She took the field, like the meanest among them, to assert the cause of public liberty and to seek revenge for her body seamed with ignominious stripes, and her 2 daughters infamously ravished. From the pride and arrogance of the Romans, nothing is sacred. All are subject to violence. The old endure the scourge, and the virgins are deflowered. But the vindictive gods are now at hand. A Roman legion dared to face the warlike Britons. With their lives they paid for their rashness. Those who survive the carnage of the day lie poorly hidden behind their entrenchments, meditating nothing but how to save themselves by an ignominious flight from the din of preparation and the shouts of the British army. The Romans even now shrink back with terror. What will be their case when the assault begins? Look round, view your numbers, behold the proud display of warlike spirits, and consider the motives for which we draw the avenging sword. On this spot, we must either conquer or die with glory. There is no alternative. Though a woman, my resolution is fixed. The men, if they please, may survive with infamy and live in bondage. And it's at that place I'm going to stop for tonight. I have a couple more paragraphs of that. Then we get down to Capt and Caesar and the religion. Any questions or comments before we go? I love this stuff too. Wish other people did. I'm working hard to read this right. If I could do it off the top of my head, I would. Thank you all. Love you. Have a great day tomorrow. May Yahweh bless you, and I'll see you on Shabbat.